Hello, everybody, and welcome to the FMB's webinar. My name is Hayley Lorimer. I'm Director of Membership at the Federation of Master Builders, and welcome to today's webinar, which is entitled Why Write Simple Contracts. So I hope everybody watching is well. This is being recorded on Tuesday, the 20th of October, 2020, and it's the first in a series of at least 4 webinars over the period of the autumn. Every couple of weeks up until the beginning of December, we're going to be talking about contracts. And that's because contracts are a very important and well-used benefit of membership for FMB members. With during 2019, well over 8,000 contracts were downloaded by members from the FMB website. So it's clearly an important thing for our members to use, but also something that members struggle with from time to time, alongside all of the other tasks and obligations that our members have in terms of running a small building company. Contracts is an additional thing that sometimes causes some concerns. So fear not, because we have Sarah Fox with us today, otherwise known as the 500-word lawyer, who is going to start right at the beginning for us and demystify contracts and talk about the benefits of keeping things simple with regards to contracts. This should take about, Sarah's presentation will be about half an hour or so, but with questions as well, we aim to be finished between 45 minutes and an hour from now. So you can ask questions throughout the webinar. There's a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, so post your questions in there, but we'll save them until after Sarah's presentation, and I'll try and collate them and relay them to Sarah at the end there. After the webinar, you will receive a follow-up email about 24 hours afterwards, which will give you the link to the recording and all the dates of the future webinars that you can book onto as well. So without further ado, I shall now hand over to Sarah. Over to you.
Thank you, Hayley. So I'm just going to share a brief presentation so that you can follow as we go, because I know contracts are a bit of a headache. I will keep the text simple, as you might imagine. I'm a big fan of simple contracts. So it was about 2017 when the Federation of Master Builders approached me to simplify the suite of contracts that you had, because we knew that when presented with long contracts, too many checklists, fill-in boxes, options, sometimes when you're trying to run a business, the last thing you need is more complexity, head scratching, questions that you may not even have answers to. So what we wanted to do was to make a simple short form and to simplify the domestic and commercial contracts, and to turn them from just a download that you have to print out, fill in, get signed and shared, to something that you could do with an editable PDF. Because, you know, if you don't have an office, the idea of being able to only create a contract if you can get back to an office and a printer is not very convenient. And of course, at the moment where we're not meeting people, we're not doing face-to-face meetings before the work start, that's proved to be extremely useful, to be able to send a document to someone by email for them to get it signed. As Hayley has said, you know, the usage has gone up substantially. It's doubled in the first year. And as word spreads that your contracts are simpler and easy enough to use, then hopefully that use will increase. So your contracts have to do various things for you. They have to be legally binding. That's not actually that difficult to achieve if you've got a proposal and an estimate. But you also need to use your contracts to demonstrate that your client understands, that you understand your client's needs, to show that you're competent and trustworthy. And a contract's actually quite a good sign that you understand how to create a formal relationship rather than just turn up and do the work. It also helps to explain to a client what it looks like to do a construction project, because you may have done hundreds, if not thousands, of construction projects in the course of running your business, but many of your domestic clients will never have had one done before, and their own experience comes through television programs, word of mouth, whispering on the streets, chats down the pub when we used to be able to go to the pub, and kind of myths and legends about construction projects. So the whole purpose of a contract is to help manage that process a bit more effectively. And you can create legally robust, really simple contracts. As you might imagine, my company is 500 words, and I pioneered the idea of a 500-word contract, not because I thought 500 words in itself was a fabulous goal, but just because somebody dared me effectively to do it, to see whether it could be done. And if you strip away a lot of the stuff that currently ends up in contracts, you can in fact simply state what you're going to do in 500 words. You're probably well aware of the fact that we have a few issues with contracts. The other suites that are available in the UK construction industry, particularly the JCT suite and even the NEC suite, can be extremely complicated. And standard form contracts that have been proposed, and let's face it, we have nearly 150 standard form contracts, subcontracts, appointments and warranties from 12 different publishers, of which the FMB is just one. They tend to assume a quite sophisticated client who has a good understanding of the construction process and also all the jargon and the legal jargon that we see in construction contracts. So they understand what phrases like extension of time, loss and expense, contract administrator, all of that means. But they're often far more complicated than your clients would like or your projects actually need. Now, quite a lot of the excuse for writing complex, long, detailed documents is that they have to be comprehensive or watertight. The reality is you can't provide ever a contract which is watertight or completely comprehensive. And one of the things we've seen coming out of the recent times and the pandemic is more clauses being added to contracts to try and make up for loopholes that or gaps that didn't exist because we didn't expect this to happen. So a simple contract is better than a complex one because it kind of positively encourages you to get things signed. So I did some research a few years ago looking at the size and length of existing standard form contracts. And you know what, a JCT, even if it's not amended, the bigger JCTs, which I'm assuming you don't use on domestic projects very often, but they're 50,000 words. Now that's the equivalent of one of the short Harry Potter novels. That's an extremely difficult document to send to someone to get them to understand what they've got to do quickly and to be able to find what they need quickly. So a contract has to be not just easy to read once and then put to one side going, yep, got it. A contract has to be good enough that you can actually find what you need when things happen. And this really became apparent also during the pandemic when the first lockdowns happened in Scotland and Wales and England, and there were slightly different levels of lockdown depending where you are. People were starting to kind of flick through their contracts to try and find the answers. So the sheer complexity of these contracts does make it difficult to find what we need when we need it. The other problem that we have with contracts is being able to sign them quickly enough before the project starts. It seems to me that if a contract is going to help you do a project, then it needs to actually be signed before you start, because otherwise you kind of just heading off in maybe the wrong direction. The data from the NBS survey from 2018 showed that only 2/3 of projects had a contract signed before they start work. Now that's about 30-something billion pounds worth of work being done every year without a contract being signed. I don't think that's best practice. And if the one thing that you take from this talk is that the simpler you make your contracts, the more likely you are to get them signed before work starts. And that then helps you to do the project properly. So do get your contract signed before they start. And one of the reasons why we don't get them signed is because they're too complex. There's too much to and fro, too much negotiation, too much, we're not quite sure what this means. The other thing that we have with contracts is that they are quite adversarial. And that means that they're generally designed by a particular industry body with the interests of only their members at heart. And one of the things we definitely did with the FMB was we didn't want to make it too one-sided. Although they help you as members, they're not meant to also punch your clients in the face or do the equivalent of. See, really, we don't want your clients to feel like they've done 10 rounds with Mike Tyson by the time they finish just reading the contract, because that's meant to be the point at which you're on the best possible terms with them, not when they're feeling a little hard done to. Your contracts shouldn't annoy your clients. They shouldn't make them feel unhappy or defensive, or they shouldn't make them feel like they've been cornered. So you really need a contract which is clear, concise and trustworthy to create that sort of atmosphere. A contract say that you could pin to your notice board, stick to your fridge or have on your tablet, rather than shoved in a drawer because you're all a bit embarrassed by it. So Hayley's going to launch a poll to see what you think some of the issues for you when it comes to existing contracts. And I don't mean the current FMB suite, please do let us know what you think about them, but I'm thinking about other contracts you might have come across. What has been your biggest issue with them? Are they too complicated? Is it because you can't actually administer them because you've got to print them off, get them to sign? A wet sign means with a pen rather than anything else, or that they're too one-sided. So let us know what your views are. And then maybe when enough people have voted, Hayley can close the poll and release the information.
So Sarah, I don't know if you can see the poll on your screen now as well.
Yeah, I can see the poll on my screen, yeah.
Yeah, excellent. So I think probably as many people have voted as are going to now, which is 2/3 of people who are saying that 70% of them are saying that contracts are too complex, and a smaller number are also saying that they are too one-sided, or the fact that they're paper-based and wet signed is an issue. So thanks for that, everybody.
So there's the answer. So 68% are saying too complex, 14% paper-based, and 18% one-sided. So, you know, we can get rid of the paper relatively easily nowadays. Getting rid of the complexity is slightly more difficult. So I'm a big fan of simple contracts. And the reason I got involved in writing simpler contracts is because I trained people on the existing standard forms. And I realized there were very few people who could honestly say, hand on their hearts, that they'd read those standard forms, and even fewer who could say that they knew what they had to do because they'd read those standard forms. Generally speaking, people only were reading the bits that they needed when issues were happening. So I think simple contracts are really useful because they can create confidence, both especially for your clients, but also for you. They can safeguard your business as well as the big complex contracts, and they help avoid disputes. And that might sound counterintuitive, but we'll explain what I mean with each of those. So just want to think about some of the reasons you might have for simplifying contracts. We've already said, thankfully, that you found them too complicated, or 68% of you said that they were a bit too complicated. So the next poll is to think about some of the reasons we might have to simplify those contracts. So you can only choose one, even if more than one applies. Apologies for that. So choose your favourite. If it's not on there, then something else will be your answer.
So Sarah, we've got 80% of people have voted now, so I'll probably end that and share the results with you. And you won't be surprised to see what the most common answer is. Can you see that on your screen?
Yep. Confidence, really, really interesting. That confidence is such a high thing. So, and interesting that I kind of basically picked what you were thinking of. So yeah, there was nothing else. Mm-hmm. So confidence is really important because actually you need to create confidence with your clients. And I think simpler contracts do create that confidence. It's a bit like if you were having a tandem parachute jump, really you need someone who is confident at all aspects of doing a tandem parachute jump, that they pack it correctly, that they leap out of the airplane correctly. You don't want to find halfway down that they're not very good at the landing bit. And I think a simple contracts helps to set that expectation that you know everything that you need to know from the start of their project to the very end of it, that you will look after them and that you're there to help them achieve their project. Because really they don't want you to start on a bit of a rough footing. Some people will judge you on the quality of your paperwork. I know that might seem weird, but they do. So the one thing that we can do is if we can create a simple contract that talks the client's language, it can help create confidence with our clients. So one of the ways that the new FMB suite can create confidence is by using simple language. So as simple as what we can do and what we can't do, what we're not doing, and what the client's responsibilities are. So good, clear headlines, good, clear language. And it's really important when you're working with consumer clients because the Consumer Rights Act 2015, which applies in England and Wales, asks for transparent terms. So that means terms which are in plain language and intelligible. And around the world, so wherever you are, the idea is that we should have contracts with consumers, ordinary individuals, ordinary householders, which are much simpler than maybe we might have in a business-to-business context. So simple language speaking the language of your client is really useful. And this is what we did in the new contracts. And there had been conversational language in previous week, but it had actually stopped when it came to business contracts. But we tried to make it as even simpler than just using a conversational tone, trying to get rid of as many bits of jargon as we possibly could so that clients could really grasp it properly. Then we also wanted to gather all the information about a project in one place. So whether or not it's a short form contract or one of the other contracts, we wanted the front page to be the sort of thing you could stick on your fridge, you could have on the front page of your smartphone or your tablet, and you gather all the information together in one place, because that makes it easy for a client to check that this contract records what they've agreed, what they think they've agreed, what work they are wanting doing, where it's going to happen, what constraints there are they staying in the property, have they got elderly neighbours, have they got all sorts of issues. So we wanted to try and get all that information in one place. And you can see right at the bottom of your screen, it says, if your understanding of their project is incorrect, they have to let you know, because we can make assumptions. And I had a small project done, not by an FMB member, but I was doing a porch, and actually just even the design phase, the designer had made assumptions about what I wanted that were wholly inaccurate. And it was really interesting from a client perspective to see how easy it is for us to jump to conclusions. And a proper contract could have helped avoid some of those issues. The other thing that we can get with a simple contract is it really sets out the main roles and responsibilities of the two parties. So we've split them in the contracts into what you're doing and what the client is doing. Often building contracts actually kind of mix everything up. They kind of don't have all the client's responsibilities in one simple, easy clause, because they might have a clause on payment, they might have a clause on instructions, they might have a clause on access. But actually for a client, that's really difficult to kind of pick through and find the bits they want. That's kind of like eating a chili con carne and picking out all the little bits of kidney bean, because that's the bit you like most first. So it's really important that contracts are simple enough for a client to be able to find exactly what they want quickly, so they know what they're doing. And the way we can set out exactly their role means that those people who've never done a construction project before have much more confidence that they know what they actually have to do to comply. So the other thing that simplicity does is it helps to safeguard your business. Now, safeguarding your business is one of the roles of contracts, to provide security for you. And a really good way of safeguarding your business is to set out exactly your scope of works, including what's you're not responsible for. So one of the things that the short form talks about is tasks that are not your responsibility, because clients can make assumptions that you're going to do everything related to their project. Now, you may not have the skills or the competence, you may not have priced for everything that they have in your head. And a really good use of a contract is to actually work out the fuzzy edges, kind of clarify the grey edges, so that you really understand what your role is and they understand exactly what you've priced for and what's not included. Now, I remember when I was having some decorating work done, and I thought, when I say decorate my lounge, I thought that meant anything that's not movable. I don't want the cats done, I don't want the furniture. But there was an assumption that they just meant walls and ceiling. They didn't mean skirting and architrave and all this kind of stuff. And sometimes we just need a little bit more clarity as to what particular terms mean, because you might mean something, and if the client reads it and thinks something else, then you've got a misunderstanding. So a clear scope of works is also a really good way of limiting your liability as a contractor. And accuracy helps to manage the client's expectations of what is or is not included. And it ensures you can recover costs for anything that's outside the original scope. If you've made it really clear and the client asks for something else, then you know that that's a change to the original scope. When you've got a fuzzy scope, then knowing whether or not it's a change and therefore extra money, extra time is really difficult. So clear scope of works does help to safeguard your business. It helps the clients to know exactly what you're doing. One of the things, of course, the pandemic has shown us is how important that we have flexibility in our contracts to show how the works can change. And when I say works, I don't just mean the work, I mean also other circumstances relating to the work. So all the FMB contracts do have a change management provision, and it's quite a broad management position, change provision, because we want it to be clear that the parties can change for whatever reason. They can agree changes, because it's better to do it under this contract rather than have sort of changes being partly under this contract and partly sort of all instructions. So that's kind of the worst thing. If a change process is too complicated or too impractical, it can be ignored. So you sometimes see standard forms which have really rigid routines that you have to go through before it can be a change for the purposes of that contract. The problem with that is sometimes the parties haven't read it, don't follow it, and that can be multi-million pound claims for changes where they haven't quite followed the process, so it's difficult to know whether it's in or outside the contract. One of the main risks in writing a small works contract is, in fact, that you don't spell out clearly enough what your client needs to pay and when, and how the project may evolve and change. Clients don't like surprises. So one of the purposes of a change mechanism is also to agree the extra costs, the extra time before you do those extra works. Because really, getting to the end and finding the bill is 10%, 20%, 25% more, you might know that that's fairly common in the industry, but a client may not have that money, may not have kind of worked that one out, may think, as almost everyone on Grand Designs, that television program, thinks that theirs will be the project that comes in on time, on budget, and everything else. So making it clear how the works can change is another important way of safeguarding your business. And we also need, in every way to safeguard your business, is to include an escape clause, because the purpose of a contract isn't actually to keep them stuck together forever to the end of the project, come what may. If your client won't pay or can't pay because their circumstances have changed, or if it turns out that they want something that you don't feel you have the competence to provide, then you should have a way to swiftly end the relationship. The other thing is, for consumer contracts, you have to have a 14-day cooling off period, and those have been incorporated in all the consumer contracts for the FMB. Those things are really important, because clients want to know that if you don't do what they want, then they can also just get rid of you, get you off the job. So it's important to have a right to escape the contract in specific circumstances, not just because they don't like you anymore, but for really clear, crisp circumstances. So simplicity is useful because all of those things become obvious, but simplicity is also useful because it helps to avoid disputes. Now, this picture is not because we ended up in a dispute in this film, but really because the length of the contract made it very difficult. And in fact, he was considered to be the only person who'd ever read the full length of the contract relating to picking up the ring. And there were clauses in there that we decided not to incorporate in the FMB contracts, things to do with dragons, death and all that kind of stuff. But it's a sign that actually, even the best will in the world, we can end up with contracts which have kind of got a little bit out of kilter for what we really need. So we want to avoid disputes, and one of the ways we can do that is to make them easy to read, because a contract that is easy to read with clear headings, short sentences and simple words will be transparent, so it will meet the requirements of the Consumer Rights Act. But if it's easy to read, then your client is more likely to read it. You're more likely to read it. We're all more likely to read something, which makes us want to read it. These sort of words on the screen aren't going to put you off. They're simple phrases. They make sense. They kind of flow nicely. This is not complicated Charles Dickens. This is not complicated legal tomes. This is not something that puts you off. It doesn't assume and make you feel defensive because of the way it's written. So simple contracts are easier to read, and that's their nature, is to be easy to read. But the other thing we wanted to do was to make them easy for clients to understand. So one of the things we developed, and this is not actually in the contracts, this was one of the prototypes, it just happens to fit better on a screen, was a timeline to explain to clients that the timeline set in the contract is not necessarily how it will go in practice, to give them an indication of what happens if they don't provide access, or if they fail to pay you and you have to suspend works, or if the works change and therefore the time changes. We wanted clients to understand the process better. So we used this simple timeline as a means of helping them to understand. We wanted to avoid jargon and technical terms, because we don't think it's just the lawyers who need to read the contract. We think you and your clients need to read it too. And because it's transparent and easy to understand, clients will raise queries, ask better questions. They will realize that this is not a Bible of answers for, for all circumstances ever, that it's a framework around which you have to work together in order to complete their project. And once we've got it easy to read and easy to understand, we want to make it super simple for you to finish. So we need to give you something that's a tool that will help you do business, that's not a barrier to doing business. So we wanted to have, as we said, all the information easy to fill in, collate on one place. You don't have to keep skipping through to the clauses to check that you've filled everything in. It's all in one place and it's well highlighted. So the purpose of simplifying the contracts was to give you confidence, because you can read them, you can understand them. It was to make it easier for you with paperwork by, making it easy to use, reduce the amount of paperwork. It was to help manage the client's expectations by making it clear what their role was. So we've tried to hit all those niggles that you currently have with contracts. And the purpose of these webinars is also to give you more confidence about these contracts, so that you understand things to do with the parties, the works. We're looking at time and cost. We'll be looking at quality and project aims. All of those will be covered in the webinars before the end of this year. So you should have all the confidence you need to use these contracts properly to protect your business. So I was just interested, just because that's the sort of thing, is whether or not you've used the new FMB suite of contracts. So Hayley, could you just launch the last poll? So admittedly, number 1 would count as a leading question in legal terms, because it assumes that you find them easier. However, if you have used them and you don't find them easier, just let us know in the Q&A and we'll deal with that.
Okay, I think most people have voted now, so I will just share the results on the screen.
So it'd be interesting if those of you who haven't used them and don't intend to use them could put something in the Q&A, and maybe we'll come back to that. But I think it's really important to realise that simpler contracts can actually do your business the world of good. They don't create any harm. They're not risky. I know lots of people are waiting until they're proven to work, but actually the vast majority of projects are done under simple contracts. We just don't know about them. They're done under estimates, they're done under quotes or proposals. They're done in a way which is much simpler than the existing standard forms that most people talk about. And clients really want less scope for debate, less scope for uncertainty. They want the ability to know what they have to do to get this project working, because this project's important to them. They wouldn't be giving their cold hard cash if this wasn't an important project. And generally speaking, the thing about the construction industry and contracts is everyone's waiting for somebody else to come up with the bright idea of how we can solve the culture, or solve all the disputes, or solve all the difficulties we have. But actually, sometimes the bright ideas are just the simplest, which is to strip a contract back to what it needs to create a good working relationship, record everything that is important, and get the project started. Because pretty much none of you went into construction for the paperwork. That's me. I went into construction only for the paperwork. But paperwork shouldn't be a barrier for you working with your clients. It should actually be a positive tool to help you do business with your clients and build trust with them. The reality is that for an awful lot of contracts that are used in the construction industry, the contracts have been written to suit the legal profession. So they're written by lawyers for lawyers. They presume that there will be a dispute, that a court will have to look at it, that there will be fighting over who's right and who's wrong. So they're effectively designed for legal enforcement rules. They're not actually designed for the majority of projects, which might not go 100% smoothly. I'm not saying you're all paradigms and perfectionists, though I'm sure a lot of you are extremely good at your job, but there'll always be a little bit of friction in these projects. But actually, we can reduce the friction by having simple contracts because the processes are easy to follow. And actually, why are we drafting contracts for the very small percentage of projects that end up before a lawyer and before a court, when in fact, the vast majority of them don't need lawyers to get involved, and you may not want lawyers to get involved on your project. So we need contracts that are tools to help you manage these projects properly, not just contracts which suit the legal profession. So that's all I wanted to say in terms of the presentation. Hayley, shall I stop sharing my screen and then we can do Q&A?
Yeah, that'd be brilliant. Thanks, Sarah. So we've got some really good questions that have come in from the members. We'll work through those. But first of all, I wanted to ask a question that came in before the webinar, which is the content of this and the other 4 webinars on contracts that we're doing this autumn all equally applicable to members who are in Scotland, Northern Ireland, or wherever they might be? Because there are differences in the law, but I think the general principles that you're talking about would apply across the board.
Yeah, so the general principles will apply. There are some nuances. Obviously, the Consumer Rights Act applies in England and Wales. I think there's an equivalent version in Northern Ireland. I'm not entirely sure about Scots law, but where it does come up and it's critical, we will make sure that that's referred to in future webinars. It's the only bit of law that we quoted in this webinar was the Consumer Rights Act. And even if you are in Scotland, even if the Consumer Rights Act or equivalent legislation doesn't apply, the idea that you should actually have contracts which are transparent and legible and your clients can understand is really important. And we have had all the suite of contracts checked by local lawyers to make sure that they do comply with local legislation. So if you use one of the suites, you can be sure that contract does meet all the requirements of local laws.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So you just mentioned the Consumer Rights Act, and Christian has raised a good point about if transparency in terms and conditions is key, how do we end up with really complex JCT or similar contracts being valid? So
the majority, it's a really good question, and it's one of the ones I've been banging my head against for the last 25 years. The majority of standard form contracts are designed for big corporate projects dealing with other big corporates. They're not designed for SMEs or micro enterprises or 2 women in a van sort of businesses. So they don't really focus on the needs of FMB members or, the 350,000 SMEs and micro enterprises that we have in the UK construction industry. We have millions of small companies, and that doesn't mean they're insignificant and they don't do insignificant projects. Some of the projects you do will be in the hundreds of thousands of pounds, but a lot of the contracts really don't focus on consumers. There's very few of the standard forms which actually take into account the needs of consumers at all. The JCT have a couple of contracts, but really they're not really designed to be used by your members. Sorry.
Okay, that's great. So Martin has raised a question about deposits. He said that they use the FMB contracts, but they have to adjust them to take account of taking a deposit, and it would be better if that was included in the contract in the first place. I must admit, I thought it was actually, but perhaps not.
Well, I think you can set the payment scheme however you like. So the stage payments are up to you to decide whether or not you get paid before work starts, after work starts, whether you get paid in monthly payments or stage payments or milestone payments, or just sort of a quarter every quarter of the program. So the stage payments can be set exactly how you want. So a deposit, though generally speaking, doesn't have any legal meaning. So if you want to get paid before work starts, that's not necessarily just a deposit. It's to reflect the fact that you're actually doing work, you're doing design, or you're doing preparation, or you're, gearing up for the project, even though they haven't yet seen you on site. So stage payments, whether or not you call it a deposit or whether you call it a first stage payment, it's the same thing and legally the same thing. Now, if you're talking about actually having an extra right for the client to ask for their deposit back, then that is more complicated. And one of the things we tried to do was take out the sort of some of the optional elements that not many members used. Some used, but most of them didn't, because we recognised that by having too many options, it's like that paradox of choice. We kind of get slightly, rabbit in the headlights when we see too many choices. It's difficult to know which one we should have. And if somebody said to you, it's like when you go into fridge, when it's empty, you just eat what's there. When it's full and jam-packed, like over Christmas, when it's full of goodies, it's really difficult to know which bit you should go for. So one of the things that we were trying to do was to try and reduce the amount of optional choice that wasn't used on all the projects, to make it just easier for most people to fill in the contracts.
Yeah, I guess the same applies to the retentions as well, doesn't it? Because we had some members asking for a retention clause in the contracts, but again, that's just another stage payment, only it's a defect stage, isn't it?
Yes, so it is. We changed it from being a retention where you're holding on to part of the money they would otherwise have paid, or the client would holding on to part of the money they would otherwise have paid, to just a final stage payment at the end of the defects period. Because the two are slightly different in legal terms, whether or not it's your money that the client is withholding or you're not yet entitled to it because it's a final stage payment. So that's why we tried to keep it as simple as we possibly could, rather than, trying to split hairs slightly.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Sarah. So Vanessa has asked, would you use this contract for really small jobs like repairs where the amount is tiny? Because it could feel a bit over the top. And I guess that's where the short form contract comes in.
Yeah, so I think even unless it's sort of less than 100 quid sort of repairs, I think a form of contract, even if it's just a short form, is a really useful way of setting the boundaries, because often we don't know whether a project is in fact going to start off as being a small set of repairs and then turn into, before you know it, an extension or, a remodeling, or you find something during those repairs that means you've actually really ramped up the amount of cost and risk. So I think sometimes it's useful to take a slightly more sophisticated approach, even to smaller, really small works, because that means that if your client does get happy, does want more stuff, does keep saying, oh, while you're here, could you've got a little bit of framework that you can put that on. Otherwise, you can be on a bit of a hiding to nothing. And we know that even small scale projects can result in serious liability if you get it wrong. So if you were doing gas repairs or, something similar, you could end up in serious liability. So it's worth kind of tightening up the edges a little bit, even if you're doing small scale repairs. Yeah.
Okay, great. Here's a couple of comments, compliments actually, Sarah, for the contract. So Christian says that he finds that the FMB contract is fair and they've recently completed a £1.7 million job using a domestic contract. So it's worked really well. And he also believes that they're massively positive and make you look very professional and switched on, exactly as you were saying earlier. So that's all great.
Thank you.
Vanessa is asking, would there be a way to personalise the forms so that they could add their company logo onto the contract? I guess that's a technical issue, that we could maybe adjust the editable PDF so that there's a way of uploading a logo onto it. That's one that I'll maybe take away and investigate. But there's no legal reason why that shouldn't be on there, is there, Sarah? So
no, there's no legal reason at all why you can't do it. And actually, as and when the FMB moves to, say, a contracts hub where you basically fill in the form, and then you can even put colours in, you can change it so that you've got your own font. So there's lots of things you can do with more digital formats of contracts, but that's maybe just a little bit further down the line.
Yeah, okay. So there's lots more questions coming in, Sarah. So Christian again has asked, with a defects liability period set at 6 months, how does it fit with the consumer rights period, which is around 6 years?
Well, they're two very different things. So the limitation period is the right to bring a claim for breach of contract, and that would be the 6-year period that you're thinking of. The defects period is an additional remedy on top of the limitation period, and the defects period is when you should be told about defects and you have a right to go back and sort them out. So rather than them having to bring a claim for defects in that 6 months, they just give you a ring, send you an email saying this isn't working. You then go back at a time that's convenient to both of you and sort it out. And that keeps those claims out of the court. After the 6 months, you then still have another 5.5 years in which they could sue you and bring a claim in court or in adjudication if there is a defect in the works that they think is important enough to bring a claim. So they sit side by side, but the defects period of 6 months is just an additional bonus for the client, but you wouldn't want that going on for 6 years. Some clients might just start to take advantage if they had 6 years of ringing you up going, by the way, something's fallen off again. And also during that time, they will be interacting with what you've built, and they will be, you know, their children, their dogs, all that kind of stuff will be in creating more than just fair wear and tear. And you shouldn't be on the hook for the next 6 years of keeping their property pristine. This is not a magazine world that we live in. They have to look after it themselves.
I'm sure our dispute resolution team have had some clients ring up who think exactly that the builder should be on the end of the phone for 6 years to come and attend to every little thing.
It's a nice idea. It's just not very commercially practical.
So someone has asked, on very small projects such as decorating a bedroom, how acceptable is it to just give them a letter thanking the client for accepting the quote with a specification, contract sum, and giving them the 14-day cooling off period information? Does that count as a contract?
Ooh. So we will talk about the bare minimum that you need for a contract in the next webinar, but actually the two things you absolutely have to write in your contract is who's doing it. So who is the client? So that's a really important point to get right when you're dealing with people's houses. Who owns it? Who's living in it? Who's a tenant? So who should you be contracting with? Both parties, one of the parties, who owns it, and who you are. That's normally easy because you've got it on your letterhead, and then the works that you're carrying out. So that's the bare minimum you need for a contract. So yes, a specification, price, schedule, rough idea is useful. If you can put something in that confirms whether or not what happens if there's changes. So if they come midway through and realise that the shade of orange they asked you to redecorate isn't actually working for them anymore, you need to think about how that might impact. So having some sort of change mechanism is quite useful, given the likelihood that we know that clients have a tendency to change their mind when they see it in action. So yes, you can do it exactly like that. You could just have a simple specification, letter, scope of works, price. Make sure that your prices, if you're dealing with a consumer, inclusive of VAT. All prices for when you're dealing with consumers should be inclusive of VAT. And if you believe that that together, plus the cancellation rights, is transparent and the client can understand it, then that's good enough.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sarah. So a question here from Clinton. I hope I'm understanding this correctly. He says, we sometimes supply the contract and the client doesn't sign it, but into the works. So I guess he means they've started the work and then the contract is still unsigned. Is the contract still legal? And I guess you addressed that at the beginning of the presentation, really, but anything more to say on that?
Well, contracts ideally should be signed because it's the best evidence to say, yes, we both agreed it. If you send them a contract and they don't do anything, you're not entitled to turn up at work and just assume that they've accepted it. So silence under English law is not acceptance. It would be the same under, I think it's the same under Scots law and Northern Ireland. So if they do nothing, you're not entitled to turn up, do the work, and then just go, right, now you're paying for it. But if you send the contract, they ring you up, set a start date, let you on site, make your cups of tea, pay your invoices or your deposit, then all of that is conduct which relates to the contract and is evidence of their acceptance of the contract. So English law looks at, and the laws are fairly similar, but with slight terminology changes. We look at who's offered to do something. So you've offered to do goods, works and services and a price. How have they accepted it? And you can accept it in all sorts of ways. If you send a contract and they write back and just say, I agree, that is as good as acceptance as signing on the dotted line as well. So anything they do that relates to that can be acceptance. So if they ring you up and ask you to start work, if they pay an invoice, all of that is related to the contract and is likely to count as acceptance. But ideally, If you can't get them to sign it because they say, oh, I can't print it and sign it, I can't work out how to do it, or they get all technophobe with you, just say, well, just send me a letter saying you accept it, or just reply to the email saying I accept. All of those things are good enough in law to count as acceptance of the contract and to create that, clear paper trail that explains who's doing what, when and why.
Okay, great. That's really clear, Sarah. Nigel has asked a question saying that the contract says the client must pay within 14 days of receiving a bill. Can the form be amended to allow the builder to decide how long the client has to pay, i.e. 7 days? I seem to remember getting the same question from a member at the early stages of when you were developing the contracts, who wanted to say for immediate payment.
Yeah.
And I think that that's not really within the spirit of the Consumer Rights Act, is it?
So, well, generally speaking, you can ask for payment as soon as you like it. If you would want them to pay within 7 days and it says 14, you could have a covering letter that just said, this contract asks for payment within 14 days. We have agreed 7 days. Or you could say immediate payment. The difficulty that you have with most consumers is they don't actually have the cash sitting in their bank account. Most of them will be using a loan from a bank or a building society, so they'll be drawing down amounts as and when they need to pay it to you. So they won't borrow the full amount and start paying interest on that. They'll only borrow it as and when they have to pay you. So just going through the process of them getting the information from you in the form that the bank likes, getting the bank to pay it to them, and then clearing it and then being able to pay it out can be 14 days. So that's why immediate payment can be a bit tricky if you put it into consumer contracts, because you might think that they've got the ready cash. It may be that they don't have the ready cash. So yes, you could amend it. You could, if you printed them off, you could write it through, or you could just put a little covering letter that said payment under clause for whatever clause number it is, I can't remember, 2 something, I think, will be within 7 days. And if the client is happy to pay you, then do it. But really be clear that even though we all like to be paid upfront, on time and everything else, sometimes it's not possible. So don't put in terms that cause more friction because they're running around trying to get it done. It's better for them to feel happy with the payment process than it is to try and kind of force them into the way that you would like to get paid.
Okay, great. Another question about 14-day cooling off periods. Can this be changed if, for example, a job is an emergency job, I suppose, that needs to be done very quickly and will only last a short period of time, like emergency repairs, I guess? Is the 14-day cooling off period still relevant?
It is a subject to emergency and urgent work. So if the client says, by the way, my water mains burst, I've got water pouring through my ceiling, can you come and fix it? Then the 14-day period applies, but it says, and by the way, if it's urgent work and the client asks you and effectively agrees to waive their 14-day cancellation period, then you can start work and they can't then cancel later. They can cancel for any non-urgent works, and they basically are obliged to pay you for any works they do in that 14-day period. So the Consumer Rights Act is quite clear about it. So you can still cancel during that 14-day period. But if you started works because the client asked you because they were urgent or emergency, then you get paid anyway. So the cancellation is kind of a little irrelevant by that point, particularly if you've finished everything that is needed, but it still kind of exists in theory, if not in practice. So yeah, all of those things are set out very clearly in the contracts. If you look at them, it does explain exactly what the client's rights are in terms of cancellation, so that the client understands as well as you do what their rights would be.
Okay, great, really clear, thank you. There's a couple more questions or comments about deposits. So Martin, who asked the original question about deposits, I think, he is asking, could we amend the contract to make it clearer so that contractors understand that they can use it for taking a deposit within the stage payment schedule? And what we tried to do was not have masses and masses of guidance notes attached to the contract, but I don't know if we could maybe take that away and look at it. I don't know what you think, Sarah.
Yeah, there's no reason why we couldn't have a little guidance note under the stage payments at the back of those 2 contracts, just to say, this should take into account a retention deposit if you're going to do, and a before works payment. I wouldn't like to call it a deposit, because the thing about a deposit is a client believes they can have it back.
Yeah.
So, you know, a deposit on a booking, as you know, sometimes they think they're going to get it back. Deposit on contract works, again, the terminology means different things to different people, so we have to be careful about using words that can't be misunderstood. It's a really important principle of simple contracts, is that you think about every word and think, can somebody misunderstand this? Even if we think that it's a really small risk that somebody misunderstands it, if enough people do, then that causes an issue. So we have to be really clear. So yeah, we could think about putting a guidance note under the stage payment schedule just to make that really clear.
Okay, so we've both got a few actions to take away from this webinar, I think then. Christian makes another comment about deposits, saying that often things like window systems, the suppliers will often ask for a large deposit as well at point of order, and the builder therefore acts almost like a bank, because they're paying for that ahead of getting any payments in. So that's a common comment from members, that they're extending quite big lines of credit to their customers. And
I don't believe that anyone in the construction industry should be acting as a bank for any other part of the construction industry, to be quite honest. We've had this before when we're looking at subcontracts, is that the idea that you hold money and not pay it to someone who's due it, so that you can, effectively they're acting as your bankers in some respects, is wrong. So I think, yes, if there's goods and materials that have long lead times, that need ordering up front, that need money because they're bespoke, then you're going to need to get some money in advance from your client, and we can make sure that there's a note that allows you to do that.
Okay, so final question, and it's a question really for the FMB more than for you, Sarah, which is around, oh no, another one's just popped up. As fast as we're getting through them, they're popping in. Metin has asked about these digital signature style contracts that you referred to earlier, Sarah, and said, when will such documents become available? And we don't actually know that. We don't have a date planned for that as yet. The FMB is just about to go live with a new website shortly, and new CRM system which integrates with that. So we've been doing a lot of digital projects just over the past few months. And so that's another thing that's potentially on the list to come on stream next year, but I wouldn't like to say for definite when, because I could be wrong, and I know there are other priorities as well. So yeah, we're definitely moving into the digital world, so that's a great thing. So the final question that I'll take, because it's coming up to 5:25 now. Ian's asked, what happens if you can't complete a job which has started because you've discovered unforeseen works? How can you get paid for the work that you have done up to that point and the costs incurred to the company? So it sounds like a tricky situation.
Yeah, so it's always tricky, because, construction projects are not commoditized, because every client is different, every site is different, every project is slightly different. So most of the contracts, although I'd have to have one in front of me to know for sure, have rights to change the works or to terminate. And that could be that you need to terminate for circumstances beyond the reasonable control of either of the party, which is what your unforeseen ground conditions would fit into. It might also be that you no longer need the granny flat for various reasons. So there is an option to terminate, and then the consequences of termination would follow. So that would generally be that you'd agree the sort of consequences in advance. If both of you were happy to terminate, you can end a contract by agreement without even looking at a clause. If both parties are happy that you no longer want the works, you can effectively end it by agreement. And in that agreement, you would agree who gets paid for what works have been done today. And unless you're in default, you should always get paid for the works that you've carried out up to point of termination in any event. And I think that's what we've provided for in the contracts, although it's a while since I looked at them, so we'd need to check that. But we will look at termination in one of the later webinars next year if we get round to it.
Okay, brilliant. So I think we'll close there for this afternoon, Sarah. That's been really, really helpful. And so I just want to say thank you to Sarah for the work you've put in to preparing for this and the other webinars that we're going to have over the next couple of months or so. And also thank you to all of our members for attending this afternoon, in fact asking some really great questions and bringing up some good comments as well. It's been really made the session really interesting. So that's all for now, and we will send out a follow-up email which will have the links to join all the subsequent webinars and to the recording of this one. And so it just remains to say thank you very much and goodbye, and have a nice evening.
Yes, thank you.